Hi, I'm Angelica Sadar. Want to make a few NRBS announcements before we get started. Leading the announcements is our annual conference is going to be October 27th and 28th. We've confirmed that Ed Hamlin is going to be the keynote speaker. And on the 27th, we're going to be having a number of hosted viewing parties throughout the country. Maybe throughout the world, but certainly throughout the country, and we'll be sending out information about that. Want to let you know Saul Rosenthal's latest podcast for NRBS is now available. It's on event-related potentials with Dr. Kutyana. After today, you're definitely going to want to listen to that. Dates to be in mind, keep in mind, the next webinar sponsor presentation is going to be with BioSource. Fred Schaefer is going to talk about adding slow-paced contraction to heart rate variability training, August 3rd. And then the next webinar in the CE series, and if you have not joined that, you still can because they get recorded and they're available, as are the sponsor series on the NRBS website. And that is going to be with Dr. Linda Walker. She's going to talk about how a multimodal approach in the clinic and home can improve ADHD behavior. And that's on August 18th. So today, Dr. Andrea Kutyana. She's board certified in biofeedback, neurofeedback. She's certified in EEG-based imaging. She's certified as a QEEG technologist. There's even more. She's certified as an interactive metronome provider. I met her years ago when she was one of my neuroanatomy instructors. She was also an instructor for EEG Spectrum International, for EEG Education and Research, and more recently, she's been teaching ERPs with Dr. Andreas Mueller. She's also published several books and chapters and articles and presents pretty regularly at scientific meetings, so we're glad she's here today. More importantly, she's a friend who I can call anytime I have a neurofeedback or QEEG question, and she even helps me when I get stuck with my seamstress work, which is the most important part of my relationship with her. The only thing I have seen that is more abundant than her knowledge and willingness to help colleagues is her modesty. And we're in it for a treat today. So please help me welcome Andrea Kutyana. She's going to speak about Beyond the QEEG using evoked potentials clinically. Going to ask you to save your questions to the end. Please put them in the chat and I will collate them so that we can get to as many as possible. Handing it over. Thank you, Dr. Kutyana.
Well, thank you. I feel like with that introduction, perhaps I should just stop now. but again, welcome and thank you everybody for taking the time to be here today. I hope to give just a very, very introductory overview of evoked potentials, and specifically how they're recorded, analyzed, and interpreted in a system that uses BMEDIC's amplifier and the brain function analyzer. So hopefully this will give you a better understanding of what ERPs are and what they might add to your clinical practice. So to begin with, what exactly are ERPs? Event-related potentials, or ERPs, are the brain's response to specific stimuli. So when a stimulus is presented, there's a series of positive and negative potentials that the brain generates in response to the stimulus. And ERPs are characterized or defined by two things: their polarity, whether they're positive or negative, and their latency, the time that they occur following the stimulus. So for example, a P1 is a positive potential that occurs around 100 milliseconds after the stimulus. So, and 2 would be a negative potential that occurs around 200 milliseconds after the stimulus. Each of these components reflect different stages of sensory and cognitive processing. This is why we say with ERPs that we can see in real time how the brain is processing information. So just some common components that are often studied, the P1 and the N1. So these are early components that occur, again, within the first 100 milliseconds or so after the stimulus is presented. And they're usually associated with early sensory processing, and they can be affected by things like attention or how salient the stimulus is. The N2 and P2 are the next components. And with the N2 being associated with cognitive processes like response inhibition or conflict monitoring, and the P2 component is often associated with attentional processes. And P3, probably the most well-studied component, occurs somewhere around 300 to 500 milliseconds. And it's usually associated with various cognitive processes. So attention allocation, memory, decision-making, things like that. And the P3 is often studied using the oddball task because infrequent target stimuli will generate a much higher amplitude P3 than the frequent non-target stimuli. And just to make things a bit more interesting, potentials can be displayed with negativity going either up, like in this image, or down. So when you're looking at images of ERPs, it's really good to pay attention to how they are displaying the waveform. Otherwise, it can get a little confusing. And the examples that we're going to look at today from the brain function analyzer, positive is always up and negative is always down. So just keep that in mind. So ERPs are the brain's response to a stimuli. A stimulus is presented and the brain responds. And even though the brain produces this response after each time a stimulus is presented, these responses are very small compared to the spontaneous background EEG, and they can be a little different from trial to trial. So it's only after numerous trials that the responses are averaged together. And it's this average waveform that we're using to identify and interpret the specific components. So why would you even want to look at these waveforms? I think if you're just starting to think about using these in your practice, it's a fair question. So these are a list of some of the reasons given as to the advantages of ERPs. And I think, first of all, they're well respected in the larger neuroscience community. ERPs are not new. They have been studied for a long time in neuroscience and in general are believed to be a very useful and informative way to look at how the brain is working. So using these, I think, kind of lends credibility into how we're evaluating the brain. They also take advantage of EEG's superpower, which is temporal resolution, timing. The EEG and ERPs allow us to look at the brain's response with millisecond accuracy. And this is really much better than other imaging techniques. They are also non-invasive and relatively painless, although some of your clients will tell you the CAP and the 20-minute boring task might be a form of cruel and unusual punishment, but they really are mild. They are relatively painless. And it essentially involves the same setup as many of you may already be using for quantitative EEG. We're just adding an additional task to what we're already recording. And since almost any stimuli can be used, it really allows us to study cognitive processes as they unfold in real time. So we get insights into how the person's brain is processing information in everyday situations. And again, because we're looking at this millisecond processing time, they're very sensitive to subtle changes in cognitive processes. So this is why they've been able to reveal differences in brain responses for things like attention and memory, language, decision-making, even emotional processing. So things that we can't necessarily get just from looking at the spontaneous EEG. And because of this, they detect all these individual differences, especially when we're using databases to compare them to, like we do using the brain function analyzer. And in general, ERPs are thought to be really helpful in studying developmental processes. So looking at maturation of cognitive processes in children, how cognitive things change as they get older. And on the other end of the spectrum, how cognition changes with aging. So I think also another advantage of them is when we combine them with other neuroimaging techniques, in our case, most often with the patterns that we see in quantitative EEG, it really can give us a more complete picture of how our brains are functioning. And I asked a couple of clinicians, because I always feel like people say things better than I do. So I asked a couple of clinicians who have been using ERPs in their practice what they like about them or what they've added to their practice. And here are just some of their responses. And I'll give you just a minute or so to read these for yourself. So in general, I think clinicians like the added information the ERPs give them about how their client is actively responding to a stimuli. And the descriptions of these patterns seem to really resonate with clients, really helping them to understand better how their brain is working. So while ERPs have largely lived in the research realm, they really are useful clinically as well. Now, if you decide to dive down this rabbit hole of ERPs, first we need to record them. And to do this, we need a couple of things. One is hardware. So we need an acquisition unit to actually collect the data. And in the system that we're talking about today, we're using the amplifier from BMedic, so the Neurolab ERP21. And this is an ultra low noise 19-channel EEG amplifier that can be used for recording both EEG and ERPs, and visual ERPs as well as auditory ERPs. It can also be used for neurofeedback training using infra-slow frequencies, the traditional higher frequency training, as well as slow cortical potentials. So this one piece of hardware really can be used for many different things in your practice. The second thing we need to record ERPs is a stimulus or a task. We have to give the brain something to respond to be able to capture this activity. So the task that is used in this system is a visual and auditory continuous performance test. Takes about 23 minutes to complete. And the stimuli that are used are pairs of images. And these images consist of either an animal, animal plants, plants, or a plant human. And the way this is presented to the client is the first image is presented for 100 milliseconds. Then there's an 1100 millisecond pause, the inner stimulus interval. And then the second image is presented again for 100 milliseconds. And then there is a longer 3100 millisecond pause before the next trial. So all of that together comprises a trial. And the total number of trials in this system is 400. So we have 100 in each of the categories. So these categories create 4 different conditions because the instructions to the client is to press the button, the mouse button, one time as fast as they can whenever they see an animal followed by an animal, and essentially not to press the button in any of these other conditions. So the animal condition creates the go. The animal plant is the no-go. Plant is an ignore condition. And the plant human is also an ignore condition, but within this, there's also an auditory beep, and that's where we get the auditory ERP from. So just to give you an idea of what this looks like, this presentation of the stimulus, it looks a little like this. So we have image 1 and image 2. And a series of trials looks like this. Now, obviously, they're not all pictures of tigers, but you get the point. They're the animals, the plants, the human, and it does go pretty quick. And it does this for 23 minutes, again, while your clients might feel like you're torturing them. So this is just a short video showing the setup and instructions that are given to the client. For those of you who have never seen this demonstrated before. And I just want to point out that in this video, both the therapist and the client screens are shown side by side. Now, if we were actually doing this for real, we want the therapist screen to at least be turned away or maybe even behind the client. You really just want the client looking at their screen with very little else in their periphery. But for the purposes of this, just so both screens could be recorded at the same time. So watch this.
Turn our screen so cell phones, watches, tablets, and all electronics are off or in airplane mode. Celebrate for the task now. Directions on the mouse as well. If you have any questions, please don't here. You should ask questions to make sure they're safe questions to do so you can do the best possible job of this task. This is the mouse, but it doesn't work like a regular mouse. It doesn't do any steering. You can leave it on the desk and you can hold it in your lap. There are 3 buttons on this mouse, but I will tell you it doesn't allow the capture or response with the phone. Press on the left or the right mouse button. And you click the button, just let it out afterwards. You don't have to hold it down very long. Just press the button 1 time when you want to click it. Double pressing the button doesn't make it double right. It'll actually mark it wrong. I'm going to show you some pictures on the screen. I have pictures of animals, lions, tigers, bears, moose, pictures of plants, flowers, grass, and berries, and pictures of people playing sports, reading, driving, running. Pictures show up one at a time in the middle of the white box and then quickly disappear. You need to watch closely to see what picture shows up. Pictures will come in pairs like this. Picture, 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 picture. With this job, there are 4 types of picture pairs you might see. The first type of picture pair would be an animal and then another animal. If that's the picture pair you see, so press the button 1 time, as fast as you can, after the second animal in the pair. Next up, you might see a picture pair where there's an animal and then a plant. If that's what you see, do not press the button. You may also see a picture pair of a plant and another plant. If that's what you see, ignore it. Do not press the button. Finally, you may see a picture pair that's a plant and a person. If that's what you see, again, you can ignore it. Do not press the button. Only press the button for animal-animal picture pairs. With this job, you'll want to weigh speed and accuracy. It's important to be a fast button pusher, but it's also important to make sure you take enough time to see what pictures show up. Don't guess. There's 2 ways to get things right with this job: to press the button when you're supposed to, or to not press the button when you're not supposed to. If you happen to make a mistake doing this job, no worries. Anybody can make a mistake. Just keep going, because the pictures will keep coming whether you're right or whether you're wrong. Remember, press the button only for animal-animal picture pairs as fast as you can after the second animal in the pair. Any questions about the directions? do the best job you can. Remember, take enough time to see what picture shows up, so you know what it needs to do. Press the button only for animal-animal picture pairs as fast as you can, the second animal you see in the pair. On the one regular face, no one uses. Love to talk about.
Right, good. So that's sort of an example of what the client is seeing. Now, from your point of view, from the therapist, this is a screenshot of what you're looking at. So again, it's the 19-channel recording that many of you are already familiar with from recording QEEGs, but there's just some extra information on this. So the yellow squares at the top indicate the trial number and the category. So the first one on the left is trial number 17, and it was a category number 4. So this was a plant human trial. And the first blue rectangle is the first image that gets presented, and the second one is the second image. And in this case, it also includes the beep, and so there's a longer blue triangle there. So the second trial is number 18, and it was category 2. So this was an animal plant trial, a no-go trial, where they were not supposed to press the button. And then the third one on the screen is number 19, and it was a category 1. So this was an animal, the go condition. So they were supposed to click the mouse button. And you can see at the bottom, there's a little red bar, and any mouse click that shows up on this bar. So you can see when they click the buttons, how long they hold down the mouse button, things like that. This information is really helpful, especially if you aren't the one recording the data and sitting there while they take this test. For me, all the files I analyze, I haven't recorded. And so going back and scrolling through the record and looking at the mouse clicks, how long they held it down, things like that, it gives me a better sense of how the client actually did beyond just looking at the number of omission errors they got or commission errors, things like that. So this extra information is really useful. Now that we've collected this data, and some might think tortured our clients, we need a way to analyze it. And the system that we're talking about today uses Dr. Andreas Mueller's brain function analyzer. But before we dive into that and how to interpret them, I just want to say a little bit about Dr. Mueller and his system for those of you who may not already know him. Because just like ERPs aren't new, this system isn't new either. Dr. Andreas Mueller, who most call Andy, has been in clinical practice for over 35 years. He's the director of the research clinic in Chur, Switzerland, CEO of the Brain and Trauma Foundation in Switzerland, president of the board of directors of HBI, and founder of several clinics, the Brain Art clinics in Zurich and Chur, Switzerland. And over the years, he's published a book on ADHD, several chapters regarding EEG and ERPs, and he really has an incredible experience and knowledge when it comes to ERPs. He also did the primary data collection for what became the HBI Med database. So as the story goes, it all began in 2002 in Portugal at a talk where Jay Gunkelman and Yuri Korpatov were. And I guess the rest is history. So Andy has been developing and using this system for over 20 years. And the system that he's created is the brain function analyzer. And it's a semi-automatic report generator. And I say semi-automatic because it's not a report generator that you upload your EEG files, press a button, and it spits out a report. Rather, it's a system that requires clinical input. You, the clinician, decide on EEG features. You decide how to mark these ERP components, which will make a little bit more sense in a bit. But the point here is that you are making the decisions with the guidance of Andy's system and the database. And then all that together, a report is then created. The database that is running in the background is the HBI database. It's a normative database, and that includes just a little over 1,200 subjects. And comparisons are made not just based on age, but gender as well. And although we're primarily going to be looking at just the ERP portion of this system today, I just want to briefly mention the other aspects of this system, because it really is a comprehensive way to analyze your client's brain and how it's functioning in addition to just ERPs. So just real briefly, I'm going to flip through these. Since we're using a continuous performance test, we also get performance data. So we get omission errors, commission errors, response time, things like that. Like you find in most QEEG databases, there's database comparisons of EEG activity, both in absolute and relative power measures. And they're presented both in a spectra display as well as 1 Hertz bin maps. Loretta is available for source localization of components. And text is automatically generated in the report describing the information describing the Brodmann areas. Theta beta ratios are also available for all 3 conditions. And Andy also has several unique indexes, like the arousal index, which is calculated in all the conditions, and it also showing how arousal varies during the task. Vigilance is the newest feature of the system, and it's a little different way of looking at the task. So not just in terms of numbers or errors or response time, but a more detailed analysis of how the individual is able to increase and decrease arousal during each phase of each trial. So it's a little bit different way of looking at that. Asymmetry and coherence, as in most QEEG databases. And another index Andy has developed is the ADHD and emotion regulation index that estimates the degree of attention and depression symptoms that might be present in daily life. And of course, the ERPs. So this system generates 12 ICA ERP components that include the early sensory, visual, and auditory, left and right association, left and right memory areas, P3B, A, and B, monitoring working memory, a slow wave activity and the readiness potential. So let's look first at how these are analyzed in the system. So when using this, you use a remote server. So this isn't software that you download onto your computer. This software and database, they live on a server elsewhere. And you have a private and secure desktop on this. And so you upload your EEG and some other files that are necessary to run an analysis. When using this system, this is an image of the dialog box that you use to kind of work through an analysis. And there are several steps prior to analyzing ERPs, but since this is our focus today, we're just going to jump ahead to that feature. So if we were going to start an ERP analysis, so we would click on this button, which would then open this ERP dialog box. And remember, ERPs are characterized by latency and amplitude. So when analyzing ERPs, these are the two features we're looking at compared to the normative database, with latency being considered the time it takes the brain to evaluate and respond to different features of the stimulus. So with the implication that shorter latencies suggest faster processing, and vice versa, longer latencies suggest longer times for processing. And amplitude, just like in EEG, is the height of the wave. It's considered to reflect the strength of the response or the amount of resources that are available to the person for responding and for processing. So very high amplitude suggests very intense processing, a lot of energy being allocated, whereas low amplitudes suggest a lack of resources or lack of energy. And each ERP component is divided into 3 segments: early, middle, and late. So we're evaluating amplitude and latency in all 3 phases of each of the 12 ERP components. So back to the ERP dialog box. This is the box that helps you make these decisions. The component is indicated at the top. So here we're looking at the P3B component. The waveform is in the box on the left, with the blue line indicating the client's activity, the red being the database, and the black being the difference between the two. So any statistical significant deviations are indicated by that green bar at the bottom. And keep in mind, it's not telling you why it is statistically significant or different. It's just telling you that in that area, there is a difference between the client's activity and what's expected. So you have to decide if that's because of amplitude or latency or sometimes both. So we do this for all 12 components, and let's just take a look at a few of those. So here we have the auditory component, and there's 2 areas that have been identified as being significantly different. First, here in the mid potentials, the amplitude of the client looks fairly similar to what we'd expect with the database, but the waveform is kind of shifted to the right, which suggests a later latency. So in this case, we would mark late latency. And then in the late potential, there's also this reactivation. We expect processing to be done, but for whatever reason, we have this reactivation here for this person. So in the late potentials, we would mark reactivation. Okay, and how about in this one? This is the P3B component, also with 2 areas of significance. First, in the mid potentials, there's high amplitude. So we would mark that as high amplitude. And then in the late potentials, there's this long-lasting negativity. And I want to point out again that you're making the decisions, not the software. So these are very clean, clear examples, but there are times when the ERPs are more noisy and you may get random hits of significance that may not be meaningful. Or there are times where perhaps the amplitude isn't high enough to be statistically significant, but you might think that it's clinically relevant. And so just like with looking at quantitative EEG maps, you do have to use your own judgment in marking these components. So one last example, and this is the P3A component this time, again, with several areas that have been marked as significant. First, in the mid potentials, it's clearly high amplitude, but in this case, it's not just the P3 that's high amplitude, but also the N2. So this gets marked as high amplitude, but we also have these extra boxes, this N2 box. And for several of the components, there are some extra boxes to mark, either in the N2 or in the visual N1. And this is because in research and in Andy's clinical work, these features have been found to correlate with different behaviors. And so there's an extra box to be able to indicate these features. And then in the late potentials, we have a bit of reactivation again. So obviously with 12 different components, there's a lot of combinations and possibilities, and we could look at these all day. But we'll stop here. I think you get the idea of kind of how this system works in terms of marking these. And hopefully you see how helpful Andy's system is with this database and in it providing kind of a guideline and framework to help make these decisions. So again, we go through all 12 components this way, and then a report gets generated. So in the reports, we get images of all 12 components, and this is just an example of 4 of them. All 12 are presented this way, along with all the significant deviations. So these are all the boxes that you checked. And probably the most helpful feature, especially if you're new to ERPs, is the text describing the component and the pattern. So in the report, for every component that gets marked, there's a description of that, as well as the implication of whatever the deviations were. So we'll look at a couple examples of those so you can get an idea of how that information appears in the report and what it might tell you about your clients. So here's an example of the visual component. And it was marked as having significantly high amplitude. And in this case, that's especially true in the N1. So this is an example of what I just mentioned earlier, that some of the components have an extra box to check for high amplitude of an N1 or N2, because those components have been associated with different behavioral features. And the text to the right is an example of what gets generated for this component. So in this case, the high amplitude is an indication of high intensity during information processing, probably due to kind of an emotional drive, and usually also associated with a lot of hypersensitivity. The N1 is actually in this component what Andy refers to as a stress marker. And this is because in research, this pattern has been noted in those who are experiencing a high level of stress, sometimes disassociation, and usually have a history of trauma. And we do see this marker often in clients who have a history of trauma. And now this is our auditory component that we looked at earlier. And remember, it was marked with late latency and reactivation. So now remember, the auditory component is generated from the trials that just had that auditory beep. There was no behavioral response, no mouse click was required. So the implication of the late latency is that this person's brain is responding later than expected to sounds. And it could be due to an auditory processing disorder. Often when we see this pattern, if you look at their history, there's reports of frequent ear infections as a child. They may have had tubes placed in their ears. And often when we see this, we tend to recommend having an auditory processing evaluation if symptoms warrant. Now, the reactivation in the late potentials is likely related to anterior cingulate functioning, not auditory functioning, and is usually associated with overly enhanced monitoring, which also is a sign of hypersensitivity. So one instance we see this is in those with a history of trauma, where they have developed kind of this overly enhanced sensory processing, likely as a protective mechanism. So they've learned to pay attention to the subtle tones of an abusive parent's voice or in the sounds of footsteps coming down the hall. This type of reactivation is also often, not always, but often, we see it when there are beta spindles at the vertex, again, reflecting cingulate functioning, which was actually the case for this person. So this is another example of an auditory component, but in this case, there is not a prominent N2. So this would be marked as low amplitude. With the implication of this pattern is that there's low activation of auditory networks. Why that's the case? It might be due to reduced sensitivity to sounds in general, or it might be an inability to process visual and auditory information at the same time. And so if this is a child who is having difficulty in school, looking into this pattern might be really helpful, because this might be someone who can't pay attention to both visual and auditory at the same time. So using strategies to help them work with that can be very helpful. So again, and sometimes in this situation, depending on history and complaints, an auditory evaluation might also be helpful. This is another example of low amplitude, but this time in the P3B component, and also with a reactivation in the late potentials. Some of the components, like this one, quite a bit of text is generated explaining the component itself. And then the implication of this is that a low P3 amplitude is low energy expenditure or a lack of resources to kind of achieve goals. This might be due to just a general state of underarousal, or it could be due to kind of a decrease in goal-oriented or purposeful behaviors in everyday life. And in this case, the reactivation after processing, again, we kind of expect processing to be over, but for this person, there's this last increase. And this reactivation in this case is kind of interpreted to reflect an internal insecurity or uncertainty about their performance. So we expect them to have performed the task and their brain is done, but for some reason they continue to activate. And this, again, seems to suggest an insecurity. So they're unsure about their performance. They don't know if they've responded correctly. They're wondering how they did. There's a lot of second guessing of themselves. Okay, and one last example. This is the Reichshoff potential, which sounds a lot better if you say it with a German accent. So it's also called the readiness potential for those of us with just an American accent. And it's an indication of motoric activation, so the brain's preparation for the next stimuli. And what we expect to see is just a slight positivity followed by a longer negativity, as you can see with the red line there. But in this case, and what we sometimes see, is there is this very high amplitude, this very strong reaction. And the implication here is that the individual prepares very intensely, at least motorically, very intensely for the next stimuli. And this is often seen when there are other patterns of overarousal, other patterns of high intensity. And again, a lot of times we do see this in clients with a history of trauma. So that's just a brief sampling of some of the patterns and what the implications of these patterns kind of mean in terms of your client's functioning. So I hope that kind of gives you an idea of that and what this type of evaluation can provide. And really, as amazing as all of that is, this system is continuing to evolve. Like I said, and some of the other features, the vigilance, it was just added to it. So Andy is constantly working to improve and change this system. And the ERPs are no different. He sent this screenshot to me earlier this week, and it appears he is working on the next generation of ERP analysis. And as you can see, it looks like it's going to likely allow for greater precision and interpretation of the components. And likely it probably doesn't make much sense unless you're Angelica and you can read German, but you get the idea of how it's going to continue to expand.
Well, that was an amazing summary. I'm remembering back to like when we first sat in Yuri's class and walked out and we were like, what is he talking about? And we did that for 5 days in a row. We sat in Andy's class for 5 days in a row and said, what is he talking about? So folks, Annie just put that together in a remarkably easy to understand way. Thank you. So some questions. Can you talk about how, like at what sites the data is gathered? That came up in a topic the other day too.
What?
So when you're gathering the information, I think this question lends itself to like the jump of understanding you have to make when you're learning about these ERPs. So the question is, at what sites do we gather this data?
Mm-hmm.
If you want to answer that, if Mitch is there, Mitch gave a good answer the other day as well, if you want to take a breather.
Oh, it doesn't matter. Like, again, I feel like most people say things better than I do. So if Mitch would like to, that's fine. But in general, so the different components, for example, the visual component comes more from O1 and O2. The auditory component actually is recorded, it comes more from CZ. The auditory cortex is not at CZ. It's just that this is where the auditory gets projected. But the difference in Andy's system is that he's also using ICA components. So instead of relying on just one site and looking at the component there, he's actually using ICA, which if you're familiar with EEG, it's the same as EEG. We're looking at the component, not just one specific site. But even in ICA, one site probably does have more influence in that whole analysis. So the different components, the 12 components, come from different areas. Again, visual being O1, O2, auditory, CZ, the association and memory more from the temporal areas, P3A coming more from the PZ, posterior midline, P3B coming more from anterior midline, things like that. Did that answer it? Does Mitch want to fill in the blanks?
Well, the only blank is the other thing that the brain and function analyzer generates in the report are the simple ERPs for the no-go, for the go, for the auditory, and those show you the ERP at all of the 19 sites in the cap. And so you often you know, like with a QEEG, you might look at those results and say, well, this QEEG result seems a little funky to me. Let me look at the raw EEG. Similarly, if you get an ICA component that, yeah, you aren't really sure about, the report generator gives you the opportunity to look at the simple ERP to kind of validate or otherwise what you're seeing in the ICA component.
Thank you. And then these are great questions because again, I remember how like we were like, so how, what are we, it was like you're talking about something from Mars.
I still feel that
So-
way.
Are the ERPs always collected with a full cap EEG?
Yeah.
Okay, and
Yeah.
and I would say yes in this case. However, we've been approached by some companies that also do ERPs at fewer sites, but then they're not going to get as robust of an interpretation. They're not going to get as robust data, so clearly not as robust interpretation. Okay. All right. Can you talk about the inter-rater reliability of, well, of the interpretation? So it's really the selection of the ERP, like the identification, right?
Within this system, I think the only way I can do that is Mitch and I often, because we both use this system, we often come up with the same response. But interestingly, I just did a reevaluate. It was somebody that I had done the previous report on probably a year ago. The name seemed familiar to me, but I couldn't even remember at this point. And I ran the second one, not even knowing that I had done the first one. And when I got to the end, I went back and looked at my files once I had already ran the report. I went back and looked at my files, and I had, in fact, already run a report on this person. And I compared the two, and I marked everything almost exactly the same as I had done a year ago. So I might still be wrong, but I was just at least consistent in my wrongness. So I think with Andy's system in general, the whole, in terms of marking the artifacting and things like that, because some of it is automated, and with the database running in the background, you do get consistency. But again, you're making these decisions, and so I don't know that it's perfectly reliable from one person to the next because you are making these decisions. I don't know if that answers the question, but
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. Yep.
Yeah, and just to add, I mean, this does give you the opportunity, if you know the patient, it gives you the opportunity for clinical correlation. I mean, Gary, there's no research that I'm aware of where they just gave the data to a bunch of people and said, look at this and see if they chose the same things. I really don't believe that's been carried out.
Question about is there ERP biofeedback? So I'll leave that to you. That's a quick answer.
No, there's not biofeedback that kind of trains an ERP response that I've heard of.
No, but there is research. There's at least, I'm thinking of one paper by Martine Arns, where he
Mhm.
showed that neurofeedback can have an effect upon the ERP.
Right. What we do with training the brain changes the ERPs, but we're not specifically training the ERP responses.
Picking from a bunch of questions. So I think you addressed some of this, Andrea. Where do we go from the results to helping the client practically? And you had that slide that had the clinical stuff in there. Is there anything more you would say about that?
No, I mean, I think it goes in, just taking all of the information as a whole, and what their patterns are, not just, and it's not just the ERPs for us. We don't just ever look at just ERPs. It's what we see in the rest of the EEG and any other testing that they have done. So it's really kind of putting all of it together, and looking at all of it as a whole. But you get a better sense of, if there are sensory issues and things like that. So there's other things you can do in terms of auditory processing or auditory evaluations, things like that.
Mhm. And hopefully that answers your question, David, as well, about, how does that tie into the treatment plan? I think, what Andrea is talking about is advocating a whole, looking at all the windows and seeing, what you can find and then piecing them together in a way, most importantly, what makes sense to the client, and what's most relevant to the client. So, yeah, and that ties in with the treatment plans. There was a question about normal values. Okay, people, and this comes up, right? People want to know what should it be?
Mhm.
Um,
In terms of the ERPs.
yes.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I mean, I don't have a number for that in terms of amplitude and things like that, and that's why I think Andy's system, in terms of having this database that's running in the background, that's comparing your client's data with it, you get an idea. Because there are some times when we look at this and it looks like a really high amplitude, but the scale is also very small. And so it can look like, wow, that looks really high amplitude, but it's not saying it's significantly different. And so it really does give you kind of a framework to decide what is normal.
Yeah, that's a point to emphasize. I mean, until Andy put together the database, we in this field had no way to really analyze and to measure ERPs. There are no other that I'm aware of ERP databases out there that we have access to. I mean, universities doing research have their databases, but this, to my knowledge, this is the only clinical database that's available to people in our field with ERPs.
Yeah, I can say, from our clinical experience, when we work with somebody, it really enhances the clinical picture that I'm able to get, but it also enhances the client's confidence in your ability to understand what their experience is. Now, I also do want to say there's a ton of research on ERPs. If you do like a PubMed search and you look up ERPs, you're going to see there's so much more on ERPs than there is on QEEG. And as Andrea said earlier, this really lends itself to then having a higher level of respect when we're engaging with people in the medical field, because they know about the research on ERPs and QEEG. They're like, yeah, there's some research. So, Okay, so I think we're at our end. Couple of dates. Remember, I hope we see you August 3rd. Hope we see you August 18th. And there's more information here. Go to the podcast and check it out. And if you like it, show that you like it so that we can get this information out to more people. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Kutyana.
Thanks, Andrea.
A very nice way to make something very complex much more simple. So, see you next time, guys. Bye.
Thanks.